Number 6 on the list, by my standards, trained by Brett Calhoun. You can see he's only won 2 races through his career, but he's never been out of the money in 5 lifetime starts. And clearly his big breakthrough was winning the Grade 2 Louisiana Derby at odds of 22 to 1. I know there were some people prior to that race, or I shouldn't say prior, after the race, they were a little bit sour on the idea that the Beyer speed figure he had earned in that maiden special weight race 2 starts back when he broke his maiden, that it was much lower than the 86, and many people looked at it and said, well, if he had an 86 leading into Louisiana Derby, perhaps he was a little bit more findable and easier to find anyway, and you wouldn't have had 22 to 1 as far as the odds are concerned. I touched on that when I recapped the Louisiana Derby. You can find that back throughout the archives. The idea is, if you think you can make the figure more accurate, you do so. I don't begrudge any figure maker for going back and amending things and going through and saying, you know what, we got this one a little bit wrong. We got to crank it up a little bit. The 97 Beyer puts this horse really kind of in the thick of things as far as numbers are concerned. And the other interesting thing about him is, if you go back, and I had said it when I previewed the Louisiana Derby, I said that this race right here, unfortunately for political reasons, we can't show any of the replays, for reasons that I'm sure all of you are aware of. But this race right here was visually really impressive. Goes off and wins by more than 4 lengths. It was visually very, very strong. The figure was just a little bit on the light side, and I said, you know, he's a fringe contender or a fringe kind of player to hit the board at best with the figures that he had, but visually, I think maybe you've got something going forward. Well, he comes through and he gets the job done here. Now, granted, I thought Spinoff, there really was no excuse for him not to win this race. Not just because I picked him, but the way that he was moving at the 8th pole, it looked like he's going to win by 100, and then all of a sudden, by my standards, comes and runs him down. A couple things that I'm looking at here with this horse, you know, the Golden Sense babies, I don't know what their strength is, and I'm not saying that meaning I don't think they're any good. I don't know what their best game is. Is it a mile like Golden Sense himself was? Is it slightly shorter? Out to 1.25 miles, I guess the jury is still out a little bit. I'm not totally convinced that 1.25 miles is going to be ideal, but the way that this horse runs, it feels like that kind of ground is not going to be a problem for him. The only other thing that we can look at as far as trying to project forward with a horse like this is now we have had enough time coming out of the final prep for this horse, the Louisiana Derby, that we can see what some of the horses that ran behind him came back to do. You'll note that he was 3/4 of a length ahead of Spinoff, who was 5 lengths ahead of Sueño. Well, Sueño has come back, and you can find this in Formulator. Obviously, you come up here to the upper right-hand corner, and you can drop down this menu. You've got a number of different things that you can cycle through. You can go through next race, though, and see how these horses performed in their next race. And thus far, it hasn't been brilliant, but it hasn't been bad. Sueño, the 3rd-place finisher, who was well behind the top 2 runners in this Louisiana Derby, he came back and earned a 93. In the 4th-place finisher, Country House, we saw him earn that 91 in the Arkansas Derby. So there's at least reason to believe that this form is holding up somewhat well. It may not be awesome, but it's not a disaster. You see Royland came back and earned an 84, and he was well beaten in the Louisiana Derby. So I think there's reason to believe that you have a nice horse here, and by my standards, the good news here, if you like this horse, he's going to be a giant price because there is, very similar to the Dubai situation, which we talked about with Pluska Parfait, there is just a negative connotation with the horses coming out of Louisiana, where maybe historically, over the past handful of years, they have not performed brilliantly, but they haven't really been terrible. I mean, you've had a horse like Gunrunner come out of Louisiana circuit and get the job done and run really well in the Kentucky Derby. I believe he finished 3rd in his year, and we know what he went on to accomplish going forward. I just kind of look at it and say, you know what? There's reason to believe, if you like this horse, that you're looking at a horse that's not that far off from the best. Heck, he might even be right there with the best of his generation. He's going to be 2 and 3 times the price of some of the shorter numbers. And from a running style standpoint, I like that he doesn't have to come from way out of it. We've talked about it a number of times in any of these sort of things that we've discussed, whether it's on this podcast or in Out of the Gate or in any of the other forms on DRFTV. The idea that tactical speed goes a long way in a race like the Derby ever since this point system has been implemented. We really haven't had the complete meltdown. Orb, look, kind of a extenuating circumstances, a sloppy track, just a ridiculous pace situation, X, Y, and Z. But you've had fast paces recently, which horses that have been able to be relatively close, they've stayed on. And you have had your horses come from the back of the pack to come up and pick up some pieces. But I just think by my standards, he's another interesting candidate. If I'm playing a superfecta or a trifecta, I absolutely want to consider using him. And I'm not completely ruling out the idea of picking him in a race like this. I like the way that he continues to improve. He goes out for good connections. We'll find out how he gets back to Churchill Downs and how he's training. But sounds like what we've heard from that most recent work, seems like everything is going very well for him. We'll find out. By my standards, an interesting price. in the Kentucky Derby. Really hasn't done anything wrong in 5 lifetime starts.